why should a farm, system immediately have sort of a business 101 model applied to it? Because we're dealing with a natural system, we're dealing with a natural world, we're dealing with so many things out of our control with weather and climate and all of that. So it's really hard to sort of create these very clear-cut expectations of numbers and yield and all of that. So why do we have this very, traditional business model applied to a farm?
A movement is underway of people abandoning the emotional, physical, and financial expenses of city living and crafting their own purpose, livelihoods, and joy in the rural reaches. The Urban Exodus podcast shares the wisdom, wit, and stories of those who decided to embark on the road less traveled to pursue their own interpretation of the good life. Small business owners, change makers, artists, farmers, and more, working towards building a better future for themselves and their fellow citizens. This podcast is for country dreamers, rural folk, and urban dwellers alike who want to feel more connected to the natural world and the purpose and choices in their lives. I'm Melissa Hessler. Welcome to the Urban Exodus. I'm excited to invite you to my conversation with Clara Coleman, the farmer and farm activist behind Real Farmer Care and Four Season Farm in Harborside, Maine. Clara was a child of Back to the Landers and was raised running wild on her parents' homestead in rural Maine. Her father, Eliot Coleman, has dedicated his life to organic farm activism and experimentation. He has written numerous books on growing food year-round. This upbringing instilled a real appreciation and love of farming in young Clara, but she yearned to see the world and left Maine to embark on her own adventures. She settled in Colorado and built a farm business there. Farming in the West required her to adapt her growing skills to drier conditions, longer seasons, and dramatic daily temperature shifts. After nearly 2 decades away, Clara returned to the peninsula where she was raised with her 2 young sons and took over running operations for her family's 4-season farm. In addition to running the farm, Clara is passionate about advocating and caring for farmers through her Real Farmer Care program. She wants to help inspire and support the next generation of farmers and help guide them towards creating sustainable and lasting farm legacies for future generations. Just one note, the sound quality of this interview isn't great because the internet connectivity was spotty when we were recording.
All right. First off, Clara, thank you so much. Such a thrill to get to speak with you. I have been following your farming journey for quite some time. And I actually, I want to say it was like 2015. I came to Four Seasons Farm and I photographed your father and your sister, Melissa, and your nieces there. So it's really exciting to get to talk to you, hear more about your own journey. Tell us a little bit about your personal backstory, how you ended up in Maine, how you grew up, and how that kind of has made who you are today.
Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. It's really fun to be here and to speak with you. I've followed your journey with Urban Exodus for quite a while as well, and it's great to see what you've accomplished and done to highlight sort of the agrarian dream and, seeing how many people are attracted to that and how they can make it a reality. So I've really appreciated your work. So gosh, my farming story, I always like to say that I learned farming through osmosis. And what I mean by that is since I was born on, my family's farm, I was just sort of immersed in farming right from the beginning, without even being conscious of it. And it's really a vastly different experience than a lot of people have. Most people are new to farming. I recognize that it, has given me a lot of advantages in sort of how I've approached farming. But I definitely did not think that I wanted to farm from a young age. I really it wasn't sort of a real intense or deep draw for me. I loved plants and I loved being outside and I loved nature, but I didn't necessarily really think that I wanted to sort of follow in my dad's footsteps and farm myself. So it really wasn't until I had children that it became something that I was drawn back to. And I think a lot of that just had to do with the ways that I grew up in being in that environment and wanting to share that with my children.
Was there anything else that you were drawn to? Was there another path that you were going down before you had your children? And what did that look like before you kind of shifted focus back to farming?
I loved adventuring. I loved being outside. Sort of the first part of my life kind of got into, I was a sea kayak guide for a number of years, kind of around college. I took people out on tours around the Maine islands and then eventually, I ended up in Colorado and I was skiing and doing sort of all that kind of stuff. So I had this real passion for adventure and being, outside. But my other passion at the time was in botany, and I kind of went down a track with that for a few years with school. But then I quickly realized that a lot of that would be in a lab or inside, and that was not appealing to me. So I kind of sort of diverted away from that. And gosh, I was doing all sorts of completely unrelated things. I was, working for an internet startup company called Wildernet, and it was actually outdoor focused. It was about cataloging all the trails and campgrounds around the U.S. and providing a platform for finding that information. But then I also worked in real estate. And so I did things very, very differently from farming. But again, I knew my roots. I knew how important that work is and was, and I wanted to see more of it in Colorado where I was living at the time. So I did play around with, I did these cold frames, in my backyard one winter with straw bales and plastic, growing greens through the winter. So, I played around with a lot of things. And then eventually my partner and I, after his parents passed away, he inherited a property that was large enough to start a farm on. So we started Divide Creek Farm, and that was back in 2008. So that was really kind of the big testing ground of figuring out, does all the systems that my dad has developed over the years, do they work in, Colorado, which is sort of the opposite of Maine and, altitude, a lot of sun, heat, more heat, arid, dry.
I can go from 0 to very warm very quickly.
A lot of extremes that, weren't as common in Maine. And so it was really interesting testing ground to see it actually play out there and work. I mean, it was still very, very difficult and hard to do, but all the principles, the fundamentals essentially worked. And that was inspiring for me. And I think it motivated me to really sort of dive more into the 4-season farming and wanting to share that information with more farmers and more people. So I got into consulting, I did a lot of public speaking at conferences, really trying to kind of share that perspective with farmers as something that could be both, profitable for their farms, but also rewarding and really help sort of local food economies expand.
Yeah, and there are a lot of farmers now that are kind of changing their seasons, right? And they're only focusing on kind of those winter farms, whereas that would typically be a season of rest. And I'm really excited about your winter farm podcast that you are doing, specifically interviewing people who are farming in the winter. That's really cool. What have you learned from that podcast? Is there anything new that you've learned? I think it's such an interesting area to look at, especially now with COVID happening kind of in the spring season in Maine. A lot of food wasn't available. I think people really started to realize how important their local farming economy was and how delicate the supply chain was. So I'm just wondering if you've seen kind of an evolution in winter farming, just even in response to the pandemic.
Definitely. Winter farming has always been more on the fringe of farming for sure, just because of its inherent challenges. You need more infrastructure. You've got to really commit to, farming year round, and there's so much planning involved. So the learning curve is definitely challenging. So it really is I used to say, well, you got to be kind of crazy to want to do this. There are so many different ways to do it. And that, I think fundamentally, that's what I learned through interviewing 10 growers for the first season of the Winter Growers podcast, is just there are so many ways to be approaching winter growing. And of course, I had this sort of more firm set kind of expectations of what it should look like. And it expanded my mind of different ways of doing it that weren't so, technically focused. They might be more about like work-life balance. Like, how do we really make this work for our family, for our community? And, resting and self-care is such an important component of that. And farming year-round is, hard on the body and the mind. So it was really interesting to hear those perspectives. A lot of the Winter Growers podcast sort of came about through some of the work I did with Real Farmer Care, which was a project to support self-care needs of farmers, and it crowdfunded campaign to basically, I was just facilitating the self-care funds of $100 to farmers and then sharing their stories on social media. And, actually, I think 9 out of 10 of the farmers are recipients of Real Farmer Care that I interviewed. So it was great to be able to get more detail about their stories through the podcast. I was also really wanting to make sure that, close to 50% of those farmers were BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, because obviously winter farming being not very highly practiced is even less with, a lot of people of color. So I wanted to highlight the farmers that are out there, share their stories, and hopefully inspire more farmers to try it out. So, yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Hessler Creative, a creative photography duo offering conceptualized brand content and in-person and online workshops. Hire us for elevated photos and videos to help your business rise above the noise and expand your customer reach. Or you can join us for an online or destination photography workshop. Explore new places, learn new techniques, and elevate your creative work. Learn more about our workshops and our commercial photography services by visiting HesslerCreative.com or click the collaborations button on urbanexodus.com.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your Real Farmer Care campaign, because it was just kind of popped up and it's just such an amazing idea. Obviously, a lot of small scale farmers, they have slim margins. It's a very taxing job on your body and it takes a lot out of you. And I think that there is a real need for more self-care and awareness in the farming community. So can you talk about why you came up with that campaign, how it's evolved, and how other people can support that mission?
Well, I started Real Farmer Care on the 1st of January in 2020.
Timely.
Which, obviously, who knew, right? Definitely good timing. And it was really inspired. Sort of looking at sort of the New Year's resolution, concept of like reflection of the year and what do I want to focus on this new year. And, one of the things that kind of came up for me was just recognizing, again, I had moved back to my family's farm in 2016 to help my dad run the farm and sort of eventually transition the farm to the next generation, to me, and sort of the new evolution of the farm, which is, an ongoing process. But through that process, it was exhausting and it's hard. It's hard to not only farm, but then hard to farm with your family and try to honor, a legacy, and really sort of understand like where your role is. So through that process, I definitely became pretty exhausted and realized, how that self-care is just so important, but so infrequently practiced or even maybe just not highlighted, not talked about. No one's really focused on that within the farming world. And, I just felt like, gosh, someone's got to start talking about this and recognizing that it's such a key part of how we can farm well and farm for a long time. So that's kind of, what started it was like, okay, this is something that I think is important. And how can I serve other farmers and give back to them? And so I just started a GoFundMe campaign and slowly just started getting donations. And then, I basically just reroute those funds to the farmer recipients. And a lot of it has been this really beautiful organic process of, initially I reached out to some of the farmers I knew, and then I asked them to start recommending a new farmer to be the next recipient. So it's been just this beautiful organic process of recommending yet another and another and another. So, it's like the work does itself. And then around the time, of the racial, uprisings and George Floyd's murder, then it just became really apparent of like, there really needs to be a clear focus on BIPOC farmers. So then, for the last 8 months, it's been more focused on BIPOC recipients and really trying to highlight their stories and how, their stories need to be highlighted if we're going to change what the farming landscape looks like. So, and, recognize that it isn't just and should never be a white-led endeavor. So that's kind of where it came about. In terms of where it's going, it's kind of an interesting, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, it's still kind of in this grassroots phase where I'm the only one sort of orchestrating it.
It's kind of beautiful that way too.
It is. I mean, it's nice because I can sort of do it very nimbly and it's a lot of time to put into it. And I would like it to reach a wider audience and not just be this little side project. So, I have been, discussions of sort of finding a fiscal sponsor. So at least it could receive larger donations, and maybe those donations could actually really be used for larger support. So it isn't just self-care.
Structure or seeds or...
Totally. I mean, self-care is important, but obviously there's so much else that could be supported. So we'll see how that evolves. I'm really excited about how that could evolve and what other partnerships and, what other synergy is out there with other people already involved in supporting farmers. So we'll see.
Well, I've just been so impressed by that advocacy work that you're doing. Obviously, I mean, your father led a life of farm advocacy and education and is really considered one of the pioneers of the organic movement. Are there areas where you have differing ideologies or approaches when it comes to farming and activism?
Gosh, I love my dad. He's brilliant. He's, incredibly charismatic. He's definitely has this huge legacy and following, and he's so passionate and dedicated his life to farming. From my perspective, I would say he's focused more on the technique, the how-to, just all of the sort of like nuts and bolts of farming, which is so essential and critical. But obviously that's still a relatively, small part of the whole picture of the farming culture. I would say where we differ is, I'm looking again at more of the emotional intelligence of farming, the things like self-care and social justice and racial justice. And what does farming really mean? How do you define a farmer? It isn't just about how you do it. It's also how does it impact our communities, our world? How do we support more farmers to live well, to be able to support their communities? So anyway, I sort of see my role has been kind of more on that side. I've also been really, focused a lot, especially since moving back to the farm, of the business side of farming too. Just really kind of trying to make it, there's the theory that yes, a small family farm should be able to support a family. But as it grows, how do you really make the numbers work to support employees and to grow that business? And all those answers are not incredibly clear-cut. I've been really curious at sort of creating more transparency around the bookkeeping, the numbers, and sharing that with, my employees, with my farm manager, just so that information is just more clearly understood and isn't just in theory so much.
I applaud the work that you do, especially because I think that there are a lot of people that get called to farming that don't really, because there isn't transparency in farming about how much it costs to kind of get a farm up and running and make it to a point where it can be sustainable. I mean, in my experience, it's been like at least 3 years really for farmers to kind of get up and running and feel like, okay, like we have a market, we know what produce we're doing, we have systems in place. And I just don't think a lot of people have like the startup capital really to set themselves up for those 3 years of growing pains. So I appreciate that you are kind of crunching those numbers. What do you feel like is misrepresented when it comes to farming that you want to speak more openly about? What does farming and being a farmer mean to you?
Ooh, that's a big question.
That's a big question.
Let's see. I mean, I guess in terms of like the limitations, the challenges, well, one thing that I've always been particularly intrigued by, I guess, and I've really been trying to understand myself, is why should a farm system immediately have sort of a business 101 model applied to it? Because we're dealing with a natural system, we're dealing with a natural world, we're dealing with so many things out of our control with weather and climate and all of that. So it's really hard to sort of create these very clear-cut expectations of numbers and yield and all of that. So why do we have this very, traditional business model applied to a farm? So those are some of the questions that I've had. And, how do we create a new system that is a departure from that? And I know, at one point I was really interested in collaborative farming models, how we can sort of leverage more people in the system and sharing resources, because obviously the resources are so capitally intensive to acquire and to operate. So those are kind of a lot of the questions that I've been curious about, and I'm still, trying to find answers to myself. So gosh, and what does farming mean to me? I mean, farming is life. I mean, it's life supporting, to be able to grow food that is nourishing and healthy and alive. I just feel like that's just a big part of being alive and being able to have meaningful work that supports that and supports your growth as a human being, how you can show up in this world in a better way, how you can support your community, your family. It's all interconnected. It's all tied together. And to me, it's represented a way to ask those hard questions and really, try to understand how to be the person I want to be in this world.
I love interviewing farmers. I'm not a farmer, but I grow a lot of my own food. I think there's like they're philosophers. A lot of farmers, I think that time being outside, working in the land, like you have a lot of time with your thoughts and thinking about other ways that we can do things, how we could improve. It's the throes of our time. What are some of your favorite defining features of the land of Four Seasons Farm and the farm?
Well, I mean, I just love the story of the farm, to begin with. I mean, I love that, my mom and dad came here in 1968. This is my mom, Sue Putnam. And, they came sort of following the Nearings, the Helen and Scott Nearing, who were the pioneers of the Back to the Land movement. And, the story goes that they went and met with Helen and Scott, and Helen was a palmist. She read palms. And she took a look at my dad's hand and saw his fate line was just, etched into his palm, so clearly. And she sort of knew at that moment that, he was sort of the chosen one to farm and to sell basically the back 60 acres of the property that they owned. So, so that's how they came about being able to get this land. The Nearings were very, concerned about not profiting on land sales. So they sold the land for the exact same amount that they had purchased it for, which was $33 an acre. And, that was a huge gift to my parents because at the time they only had, that much in savings. So that worked for them. And then this whole property was just completely forested with spruce and fir trees and, 2 inches of topsoil, very acidic, rocky topsoil, hardly any of it. And so, they started clearing the land. They built this, small little one-room farmhouse, and then just slowly started clearing more land to build the gardens out. And just the amount of work that they did to do that is just, talk about needing self-care. Just incredible and, admirable that they were able to do that, because they had no running water, electricity. It was all sort of very hippie-ish, I guess, in that approach. But, my dad had just this incredible passion and drive and, desire to make farming work. He didn't have any background in farming, so he didn't know that he was actually doing something really, really hard to begin with. So, I love that it started off as just this, really forested, unknown little spot. And now it's, got about 14 acres cleared. We've got 10 high tunnels now, multiple buildings, and an old orchard still stands here that they planted in the late 60s that is still standing. The old root cellars are still here. There's an old well. So, you just to see the history of the farm, but also the future of it all, right with one first glance is really beautiful to me.
You just celebrated your 50th year recently. What legacy do you wish to leave for your children and future generations? And have your kids shown interest in taking over the farm one day?
Not yet. So my oldest son, Bodie, is 16, and my younger son, Hayden, is 13. So I wouldn't, I know that there are some kids that, know exactly what they want to do at those ages, but I would be a little surprised if they knew exactly what they wanted to do right now. I would say one of the biggest gifts that my dad gave me too is he never forced me to farm. He always encouraged me to join him and participate, but it was never an expectation that I was supposed to become a farmer. And it allowed me to find farming myself and in my own path. And I think that's really important as a parent to provide that for your kids. So if they come back to it, great. But, I guess I would probably be more surprised, than think that was going to happen. So yeah, in terms of, the legacy or the future of the farm, that's still being figured out. It is a family kind of decision right now. For the most part, with the recent transition of the farm business to me, that has just allowed me to kind of create a newer system of how the farm operates. And lately I've been wanting to really create sort of, it's almost like a farm manager incubator program here. So I have a couple that is here for about a year and a half. And after they've been here for a year, they then train the next couple that will replace them for that role. And then same thing will just continue to happen. So I really wanted to give, the employees here more autonomy to operate this farm almost as if it's their own, so that they can really understand, what it's going to take to run a small farm like this, and, be able to really derive all of that experience and knowledge for when they go off to maybe start their own or run another farm somewhere. So it's just, it's a little bit of a departure from kind of my dad's model. He had employees here for years, some wonderful employees who've gone off and started amazing farms. But it was, he was sort of a little bit more involved in the day-to-day, the systems that he's created that would take on, that have to happen a certain way. And I like the idea of innovation and creativity coming from either making mistakes or, just not feeling like you have to be so rigid about systems sometimes. So I'm trying something new, and, for me personally, that it gives me more time to focus on real farmer care, on my kids, on my self-care, on other things that I'm passionate about and that I really want to have a voice in the farming world. So.
This season of the Urban Exodus podcast is brought to you by Jake.art. Bring the beauty of the outdoors in. A new online art shop brought to you by Urban Exodus. Search our collection of affordable, high-quality fine art prints and illustrations by color or theme to find just the right work for your home or office. or commission us to do a custom illustration or photograph of a loved one. Visit jake.art, that's JAKE.ART, or click the shop button on urbanexodus.com.
So what advice would you give to people who want to farm, but maybe don't have access to a lot of startup capital and they don't know the best way to learn how to grow? Would you say an internship program or an incubator or something like that would be a good way to explore?
Yes, but it gets a little complicated, especially more recently. You know, the traditional sort of like farm model or internship idea was, you know, you had these farms, they really needed labor, and then people really wanted to learn how to farm. And so they would, you know, intern, but not necessarily for a fair living wage. And a lot of that has to do with the farm lifestyle, or there's very, you know, the margins are so slim, so it's difficult. There's a cap on how much you can charge for food, you know, so it's really difficult to always make the numbers work. And I recognize, understand that has been a limitation that farms have been up against. But at the same time, you know, again, if we want to make this a viable career and path for people, we have to figure out how to make, you know, those numbers work, because people do need to be paid fair living wages, and they don't necessarily have the privilege to come for a year and make nothing just to farm, you know, and learn how to farm. So it's really difficult. It's challenging in that way now, especially. But I hope that because of the conversation around that's happening, that more, you know, farms will begin to sort of recognize, you know, that has to change. And how we change it, you know, is going to be, I think, an individual choice and hopefully a collective decision as well.
What about agricultural programs at universities? Are there any that you have found in your work or your speaking engagements that you think are doing a really excellent job training the next generation of farmers, food growers?
Yeah, I would say intellectually, definitely, you know, universities do an excellent job. And, you know, maybe within the last 10 years, there have been more hands-on programs that have helped that as well, because obviously that component is so key. And I think a lot of, you know, farmers or wannabe farmers would find it difficult to go from a school environment that doesn't have much hands-on right into farming. So much of farming is observational, it's experiential. I mean, it's really practice. It's doing it day in, day out, and building, you know, a knowledge base from that practice. So definitely there are some great programs out there, but again, doing it, you know, doing it day in, day out, that is probably going to be a faster way to learn the practice. And then, you know, all of that education, you can supplement that, you know, whether it's, you know, a lot of it, again, is found online, is found in books, you know, so you don't, and especially if you're not coming from means, you know, to spend a lot of money on an education is going to be really difficult to pay back, you know, as a farmer. So I always caution people to not necessarily go into a expensive school program and look at other creative ways of learning it. So,
do you have any thoughts on how we as a country or as citizens can move towards fixing our broken agricultural system in the United States?
Yeah, that's a big question, big tough question too.
I'm only asking you hardball, so you're answering them very gracefully.
Yeah, I mean, but it should be a hard question. I mean, that's the thing. Like, it is a hard question, and it should be a hard question, because the system that, you know, farming has built on has not allowed for, you know, a lot of transparency and supporting the human capital. So, you know, how we shift that and how we change that is a huge undertaking. Obviously, having these conversations is going to help. You know, obviously, we always talk about education and trying to help people to understand what sustainably, organically real food is and how, you know, they can access it, how they can grow it themselves. I mean, all those things are vitally important. But I really think, you know, again, this idea of collective and collaborative farming models, I really think that has got to be a newer focus, because trying to kind of like approach it from this individualistic attitude, I don't think is going to solve the problem. I really think that we have to have a lot more collaboration and collective farming models in the future.
Does it make you nervous that big corporations are buying up a lot of the farmland in the United States.
Of course. Yeah, no, I mean, it makes me nervous, just the statistics of, that, 97% of farms are owned by white people, for instance. I mean, that statistic is not fair and should not be the case. So, there's so many inequities within the farming world, and that's looking at more the large scale too, not even talking about the small scale models. And we're just a drop in the bucket, unfortunately, too, but we are loud and feisty. So I hope that, our voices can, make more of an impact as long as we keep using them.
What did 2020 teach you, and how will those lessons translate into your work for 2021?
Oh, well, I mean, I feel like I was very lucky and privileged in, my experiences with 2020, in the sense, I mean, it was hard, of course, for so many different reasons, but I have a farm, I have a family nearby, I have food, all the sort of basic necessities and needs I had available to me. So I feel incredibly fortunate and lucky that that was the case. But it did sort of ask those bigger questions of, we get so caught up in the doing all the time in life. And then when we have this intentional pause, how do we sit with that quiet and that uncertainty, and how do we decide and prioritize what really is important to us, and how do we make that happen? So a lot of those questions were asked of me, and I think, having that time to reflect and decide what is truly important and how you want to show up in the world, I think that's important. And the things that you want to change. So I feel like it did inform more about the work with real farmer care and self-care, and how I really want to put more energy into that. So that's definitely something I'm doing in this year, and just sort of the farm business side of it, and how to have more, transparency with that and share that information as well. I think that's important too.
Have you ever thought of running for office?
No. I will use my voice in whatever way I can. That's not something I've considered, but I will, until my last breath, I will use my voice.
I really appreciate that about you. What are your plans for the next kind of 5 years? What are you looking forward to? What are things that you're kind of, new projects that you have going on, or plans that you have in place?
I'm taking things kind of one step at a time right now, especially. It's hard
to plan right now.
Yeah, in light of the pandemic. I mean, I don't have sort of a huge list of to-do, future to-dos, just because I don't want to be focused as much on the to-do as the integration of what we've gone through, and, the awakenings that we've had, and how we can be mindful and bring those perspectives and energy into our day-to-day life. So right now it's kind of more of that like integration period, and, maybe trusting where is the world going to be, 6 months from now? Are we going to be sort of back to a perceived pre-pandemic normal, in terms of how life operates day to day? I don't have any major goals for long-term planning yet, but I'm really reflecting on that more and understanding what that might look like.
So you have been obviously a big proponent and trying to kind of change the narrative and making it okay for farmers to take care of themselves. What do you do to take care of yourself? How do you recharge?
Generally, I meditate every morning is the first thing I try to do, usually only for like 15, 20 minutes, but it's sort of the first thing I do when I wake up. And that has been transformational for me personally. It's so funny because like the word meditation always takes on such a funny...
I'm like, can I ask you like how you learned to quiet your mind like that? Because I think that you are probably programmed like me. You seem very like tenacious and go-getter. And how did you learn to implement that practice and quiet your mind?
Well, I didn't expect that I was going to quiet my mind. That was the first thing.
Okay, that's good to know.
What they say was learning a new habit, like meditation or anything like that. It takes about 6 weeks of continuous practice of it for it to become a habit. So usually the first 6 weeks is the hardest because you keep, resisting. You're like, oh, but then once it becomes a habit, it gets a little easier, I'll say. Not necessarily what goes on in my mind, but the fact that I've made it part of my routine becomes easier. So I don't judge what happens in my head. I just sit. And that's, to me, the best part of it, is I just sit. I create intentional calm for myself, even if my mind is all crazy.
That's so good to hear. I don't think anybody has ever told me that about meditation before. I feel like you're supposed to have a completely blank mind, and I'm like, I can't do that.
No, it's nothing about a blank mind. It's just about it's about not judging the mind in its process. Just letting it be. Like I'll sit there and spin on certain things, but I'm okay with that because I'm not judging the fact that it's happening. I'm just letting it happen. So, just over time, it gets easier, especially a daily practice. It really sort of helps that. And there's obviously plenty of research, too, about how healthy and important it is for the gray matter, I think, of your brain. Strengthening, I think, the vagus nerve and all this other, stuff for the brain. That's really fascinating. So meditation, being in nature, being outside, whether it's on the farm, hands in the soil, harvesting, or, taking a walk, we live near the ocean, going down to the water, going through the woods, and we have these beautiful trails through the woods that are covered in moss. And I love to like put my hands and touch the moss and like smell it. And, just that tactile feeling of just, being, there's a term for it, it's forest bathing, I think. It's almost like a reset of just being out in quiet and nature. Playing, spending time with my boys, that's another one. This year has been hard with sort of social gatherings, but trying to maintain those connections in whatever way we can, even if it's not always face-to-face. Eating beautiful carrots from the ground with, still dirt on them.
Yeah. I did have a question about kayak tours, just because you said you used to be a kayak guy. And this is something that I don't think very many people know about Maine, but Maine has more coastline if you added up all the islands than California. And I've heard of these kayak journeys that you can take that last many months. Did you run those? And can you tell us a little bit about what that's like? Because it's something that I've always been intrigued by.
Yeah, well, so the Maine coast has, a huge collection of islands, and there's something called the Maine Coast Island Trail System. So that is what you're probably thinking of. People will kind of come up with these island hopping routes. And so they'll plan these overnight trips to, camp on one island one night and then kayak to another one and camp on the next one. That's something that people do. And whether that's independently organized or there might be some outfitters that will organize that. But I did more of like the day excursions. So on Mount Desert Island, where Acadia National Park is, which is near here, there was an outfitter, and we just would take people out in double tandem kayaks and basically just go to the nearest islands and just do a quick little tour and, learn about the ecology and the geology. And I just remember, actually, I've got one funny story. I'll never forget this, but I remember, I'm not sure where this tourist was from, but obviously somewhere maybe, where they were not near any ocean because we were, approaching this small little island, and they said to me, "So, how far do you need to dive below the island before you can go underneath and come up the other side?"
You're like, nope.
And I just remember being like, how do you respond to a question like that?
Have you ever read that book, Little Island by Margaret Wise Brown?
No, I don't think so.
There's like a thing about like the island is like, well, I'm not an island because I am connected to the land.
Right.
There's just water all around me.
Right. Well, exactly. So, yeah. But, I mean, it was generally just, kind of a quick way to get people an experience out on the Maine coast. And, they might see porpoises and seals and get excited about that. But I also did eventually actually traveled across the country to Baja, California, and I did tours, more multi-night tours out on Magdalena Bay, and that's where the gray whales come to have their calves. And so we would camp out on the little barrier islands and then take day trips to go be with the gray whales as they were breaching and nursing their young, and that was amazing. That was really cool to have that experience.
That's incredible. It's like you have led many lives, and then you came back to where you started and are carrying on that legacy, but in your own tune. I don't know. I just think your story is really beautiful. I really commend the work that you're doing. And yeah, I want to meet you one of these days. once the pandemic's done, I would love to just come up there. You're welcome to come visit us anytime. I really appreciate the person that you are and the advocate that you are for farmers and the activism that you're doing. Like your father, you see problems and you work towards solutions.
Well, thank you. Please, come visit anytime. I mean, you can even come now. So we allow visitors still, just have them wear masks and keep their distance. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And it's just been wonderful. I love hearing kind of the story behind how you ended up back there and are doing the work that you're doing now. So thank you so much, Clara.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Clara Coleman. I so appreciate Clara's passion for farming and her passion for supporting farmers and farm workers. She is carrying on the farm activist legacy of her father in her own unique and important way. I encourage you to make a donation to Real Farmer Care. 100% of the money collected goes directly to the farmer care recipients. You can find a link to donate, links to her website, and additional photographs from our visit to Four Season Farm by visiting our blog at urbanexodus.com. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Urban Exodus podcast. Urban Exodus is a labor of love, and it's only made possible by your generous support. Maybe you just discovered Urban Exodus, or maybe you followed the project for a long time. Either way, please consider supporting my efforts so I can keep this going. The first and easiest way is to click the support button at the top of urbanexodus.com and pledge any amount you like. Second, sponsor an episode of the podcast as a business or individual and get a 20-second ad spot in an upcoming episode. Just click the podcast link on urbanexodus.com to learn more. Third, you can sign up for an in-person or online workshop with me or one of the incredible creative professionals through our workshops at How Hill Farm. Click the workshops page on urbanexodus.com to learn more. Fourth, you can buy something from Jake.art, our new Urban Exodus online shop. A fine art print or wall art for your home or office. A custom illustration or portrait of your family or loved one. There are so many cool things. Just click the shop page to peruse what's available. Lastly, you can hire me to photograph your business or family, or take one of my online or destination workshops. Click the collaborations page on urbanexodus.com to learn more. Another really excellent way to support is to recommend Urban Exodus to your friends and relations. Also by giving a 5-star ratings on iTunes to beat the algorithm and so that we can be more easily searchable. Your continued support will keep this passion project running. I want anyone who feels unfulfilled by career or circumstance to know that they have options and alternatives. All of the work that I do through this project is to encourage people to believe in themselves and to work towards a better future for their community and the planet. Thank you for helping me continue to do this work. You can find Urban Exodus on Instagram and Facebook at The Urban Exodus. To read more in-depth features on folks who ditched the city and went country, visit urbanexodus.com. Until next time, I'm Alyssa Hessler, and this is The Urban Exodus.